My name is Denny Paul May. We're going to talk about reading evaluations today in regards to how psychoeducational evaluations or psychological evaluations, whatever your district calls it, uh, makes uh, it the information makes an impact in really two areas. And so, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. The learning targets for today, and that's to kind of look at the components of a psychoed report and just kind of understand it. I just want to start out by saying this information is protected. This is information that where we're looking to identify a student's strengths and their needs. And that's all it is. Now, we get a diagnosis sometimes from these educational reports, and sometimes those can be really intimidating. They can be really stigmatizing. So we have to, as teachers, we have to really do our best to understand the jargon and what's behind these reports and what it really means. And really, what it means is that it allows a student to meet a criteria that's going to allow them eligibility so they can get some things to help them. That's all it really is. Okay. And so I really want you to be kind and I want you to share the information as soon as you can with parents so that they can review it and they can be ready. Can you imagine putting yourself in the shoes of a parent and you're going into a meeting and you're going in cold, so to speak, and and they hand you this big report with all this educational jargon and you're not an educator, okay? Not to say that you're not smart, but you're not an educator. We all have our own language. So part of being a really good special education teacher is being able to read these assessments and breaking down the component parts and really trying to make sense of it for the parent. That's kind of our role when we're doing eligibility. And then the other piece of it is on the back side of that, if we do in fact find that student to be eligible, um, they would have to have an adverse effect, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, and they would have to have a need for specially designed instruction. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about, hey, yes, it's for eligibility, but secondarily, and more importantly, it's for programming. It's for instruction. And so we as practitioners have to be able to look at these numbers. We have to look at these recommendations from the school psychologist. And lots of times these reports are really well done. And I did a lot of work. My background is in diagnostics. I did 10 years of testing. I am not a school psychologist though, but I did a lot of work in this area. And I'm a friend of school psychologists and I encourage them. I'm part of the school psychologist cadre that we share with KEDC, another of our sister co-ops or SERTACs across the state. And where we bring all of our school psychologists together and we talk about problems of practice and we talk about interpretation and we talk how can we make this better for our students and for our teachers that are using this information. And so this is kind of part of that. And then understanding the role of the major assessment, the WISC. And if I had to add to it, we're going to look at the Wyatt too, and we're going to look at Vineland if we have time. Okay. So that's the introduction. When we look at a psychoeducational report, we're talking about the WISC mainly. That's what we use in our region. The WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. It's for ages 6 through 16, and it gives us an IQ score. That's what we're kind of looking at. Okay, it gives us a full scale IQ score. But some of those scores are represented with terminology that we need to understand. And so I just wanted to just kind of throw some things at you here, just as a way of just some commonality. The one in the middle, the standard score, is the one that we get. Okay. When you look at the middle definition there, a score transformed so that the average is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. An example, a score of 85 is one standard deviation below the average, which is in the low average range at 85. That would be, and then the high end of that would be 115. So and we have a bell curve, and I like visuals, but I just wanted to throw this out here quickly to you. And then when we get to the bell curve, you'll see kind of how it is represented on a normal distribution of a bell curve. So a standard score of 85 is one standard deviation below the average of 100. 100 is right in the center, okay? Um, and that's a standard score. So you're going to see those SS scores all over the place, right? And you're going to have 5 areas of the WISC that you're going to get an individual score on those 5 areas. It starts with verbal comprehension, and then it's fluid reasoning, it's perceptual uh, reasoning, fluid reasoning. It is visual spatial display, and then it's working memory. And the last one is processing speed. So we're going to get an individual standard score for each of those 5 if the psychologist has done what they were supposed to do and give all the subtests. Okay, there are some subtests in there. Now, when we continue to look at this slide, it says teacher tip. Think of it like a common scale to compare across tests. Reading math can be directly compared if both are standard scores. So when we talk about the Wyatt, that's the achievements test. That's the reading, math, and writing test that we give. In general, you'll get a standard score, and you'll look at that standard score, and that's what we kind of use for terms of eligibility. And it also tells us how far away from that average score the particular area is. Okay. Now, a percentile rank is the percentage of students in the same age or grade group who are scored at or below the student's score. Now, what does that mean? Lord have mercy. What does that mean? A percentile means that if 100 people take the test and you're at the 5th percentile, you've scored the same as the 5th person, or you've scored better than 5 people. That's what that means, okay? If you go to the 50th percentile, you've scored right in the average range. So you see how that, all right, if you've got a 100 IQ and a 50th percentile, that would be confusing for parents. So you would need to say how that corresponds. So a 100 average IQ corresponds to a 50th percentile. So that means that 100 score that you've scored at least as good as or greater than 50 people that would have taken that test out of 100. And that's what a percentile is. And then you have a scaled score, and they're similar to a standard score, but they're used for subtests. And they're based on a scale of 10, okay? And so the standard deviation with this is 3. And a scaled score of 7 is in the low average range, while a 13 is in the above average range. So it's often used with the WISC-5 or the Wyatt 4 subtest. Don't confuse scaled scores with standard scores. We use standard scores, but they do show up in these reports. And then you have things like grade equivalence. You have, this is where the students' average score is compared to the grade level on which they're on, okay? The grade level at which the average student earns the same raw score as the tested student, okay? An example would be a grade equivalent of 4.5 means the student score matches the average score of a 4th grader in the 5th month of school. And then the grade equivalent does not mean the student is ready for that grade's work. It is about a similar test performance, not curriculum mastery. So you need to understand that, and you need to be able to explain that to parents. Now, what we use for eligibility is age equivalent. Okay, we do everything based on age norms. So these tests are norm tests that we give. The WISC is normed. There's a sample group, and we compare your performance against that sample group. Okay, same thing with the Wyatt. It's a norm test, and we're going to look at age equivalence, the age level at which the average student earns the same raw score as the tested student. An AE of 8 years, 2 months means the student performs similarly to an average 8-year-old. And that's what we're looking at, okay? And so but the reason we don't use grade equivalencies when we're doing IQ test and eligibility is because kids vary in age and grade, okay? So what I mean by that, students hold back. Students start school late. Students' birthdays are different. So we don't use grade equivalencies as much. Now, we will look at a grade equivalency and maybe see, okay, is this performance kind of close to what's average at that grade? And kind of use it as a point of reference for our instruction, but we would not use it for eligibility, if that makes sense. So the teacher tip here is age equivalents can be misleading because they don't show how far above or below the norm group the score really is. So you use it with caution as well. So So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that we look at those standard scores and then we dig into the raw data and we look at what is going on with that student in a particular subtest. Okay, so we would look at, for example, we might look at working memory and how that's impacting instruction. We talk a lot about that in our trainings because that's one that we cannot forego. We have to look at that and have to not only use that as a point of emphasis in our meetings for eligibility, but we also use it for instruction. I don't know why that. Two purposes: eligibility, determination of the extent of special education related services. What does the student need? And sometimes we have to really dig into those numbers and we have to see if that student is significantly and consistently below their same age peers. That is really the definition of adverse effect. And then from that, we need to dig in and see if that adverse effect is so significant. The only thing that's going to help that student is if we do something special for them, and that's specially designed instruction. If you see, so those layers of eligibility are really blown out here in the fact that we're looking at, okay, is the student meeting the criteria? And then is the student, what are the needs of the student? And are they so significant that they're going to need special teaching? Okay, they're going to need special teaching. And that's all special education really comes down to, is that we're going to then identify some goals. We're going to transfer some of this information from the psychological into the present levels, and we're going to talk about it. Now, we're not going to copy and paste a lot of stuff, but we're going to really work at explaining and making a connection to instruction. I see Stephanie leaning in. Does that mean you have something to say?
I actually do. I love the fact that you said they need special instruction and that doesn't come from a computer
It
because it
does not.
really is about the instruction that we do for that student.
And it's not, Stephanie, you're exactly right. And it's not about a test score or a label. Okay. We use test scores, they're vehicles for us to get something for our students that they need. And that's all it is. And I want to re-emphasize that because we have to have empathy. Okay. We have to work with our parents and create relationships. Can you imagine walking in there and it's your child we're talking over? Just keep that in mind that we're minimizing the effect of a label. We're minimizing the effect of a score. If you read, you're ebb and flowing all over. If I take these tests, I'm going to have high and low scores. If you take this test, you're going to have high and low scores. So you need to really think about explaining to those parents, don't get too caught up on one particular lower score that you see. Once they understand percentiles, once they understand standard scores, and it's really you are the line of defense for explaining it, taking the time in that first meeting to really go slow and explain what a standard score means, explain what a percentile means, explain what these scores really mean. And they mean that we're going to get something for our students that they might need if they're eligible. Okay. And so that's super important. I think we all want to be kind and we want to treat this with kid gloves, and we can really head off a lot of problems if we'll just slow down and really think intentionally about what if that was my child.
Another thing is, Denny Paul, I used to tell my parents when they take the WIAT or they take the WIS, that is one moment in that child's time. It's just one moment
Mm-hmm.
that we're looking at that point in time. We have to get to know the child. That's why there's so much to a true psychological that you have, because you have those observations that are put in there. And then there's observations during testing that happen. And then along with that, you should have an adaptive score that comes along with it. That's important, that not only the teacher fills out, but what about the parent or that student in himself? So that's things that we need to consider when we're doing this. It takes a while to put one of these truly together.
And I love your perspective, Stephanie, because it's not been all too long ago that you were in the classroom and you were working with these kids, and you do a lot of teaching of teachers now. And so you've not lost that touch and how it feels to be in that classroom and be working with those parents in an ARC meeting. It's been a while since I've been in a classroom teaching special education or teaching students with special needs. I love what Katie Moore says in the chat. All students are different, even if the same eligibility label. And we cannot lose that as well, because in order to provide FAPE, and I'm not going to go into a FAPE discussion here, okay? That's not the place for it. But in order to implement and provide what the student needs, we have to recognize individual differences, and we have to address those differences, and we have to account for them, and we have to address them, and we have to take data on them. The number one thing that you can do as a teacher is learn to teach to those goals and take data. And the more data you got, the more better informed instructional decisions you have, and the more that you can say that, we have actually shown some progress. And that's all is really required of the law. Okay. We can talk about the injury case all day long. We can talk about all this, but that's all is required. So we better move on. You all did a great job. Psychological report. Here's a little bit of a definition of the psychological report. It's a comprehensive document written by a school psychologist. It integrates data from multiple sources to determine eligibility. It includes cognitive, academic, behavioral, emotional, and adaptive data. And it links assessment results to educational need and instruction. So again, just a review of the two things it does: eligibility, instruction. Okay. And so that's super key. Super key. Okay, here's some components of the psychoeducational report. And I put a little, what one might look like. That's really not what they look like, but it's close. Okay. You have a reason for the referral. What's going on with the student? Okay. You have background information. And you really need to make sure it's right. Okay. You have behavioral observations on, and it's in the targeted areas that where the student is having the need is where those behavioral observations should come from. And they should be done by different people, and they should be done at different times, and they should be targeted toward the students' deficit areas. Okay. The cognitive assessment, of course, is there, the WISC, and that's what we get the standard scores from. The achievement test is the WIAT. This is the typical things we use. Now, you may see some others, and I'm going to throw some things up there at you, okay, in just a second. The adaptive behavior, the Vineland, and then you got the social, emotional, you got those rating scales. When a kid has an other health impairment, if they're ADHD, we need a rating scale. We need to do our own investigation. We can't just take an IQ score or a doctor's diagnosis and say this kid's eligible and has an adverse effect and needs specially designed instruction. You just can't do it. Okay. Interpretation and recommendations. That's if a psychologist is worth their weight, they're going to take a strong stance here. They're going to give you research-based strategies that are going to work, and they're going to stand behind their work. Okay. The ones that dodge that, they're not really doing anyone any kind of service there. Okay. And then there's the eligibility determination. Possibly they'll sometimes say the ARC should consider these things. And then there's a link to IEP development. Okay. Here's just a piece on demographics. I'm not going to take a lot of time on that. This comes from the referral, and we get the name, the age, the grade, the gender of parent, teacher concerns, and question answered by the assessment. And we need to have some information in there. Okay. Now, your developmental history, I'm going to skip that last interactive piece. We're looking at birth and neonatal history. We're looking at developmental milestones, academic history, family history, social history, medical history. Now, one of the things I would caution you, there is a provision in the law that allows for a time for a reevaluation and where you just take existing data. Students, young students especially, change a ton in a very short amount of time. Make sure you're reviewing this information and that it's current and up to date before you go to include it in a present level, or you include it in that IP where we enter into a contract with a parent for things that we're going to implement. Okay. Medical history, social history, those are all parts of your developmental history. And then your behavioral observation is those qualitative notes on child behavior during the test. The school psycho educational report will have a psychologist reporting of their behavioral observation. That's separate from the behavioral observations that we're expected to get in the targeted areas. Okay. And when they do that, they look at things like mood and affect of the child, their speech and language patterns, their motivation and effort, their attention and hyperactivity, and then the rapport that you're able to establish with that student and the social skills that they exhibit during that testing time. Now, one-on-one's different from a classroom. So make sure you realize you're going to get some observation from the classroom in real time. You're going to get some observation from the school psychologist. Here's that bell curve we were talking about. And if you just notice, the average range is 85 to 115. Above average is 115 to 130. Significantly above average. These are standard deviations. And what this bell curve is saying is most people end up between 85 and 115. And the further you get out on the tails of the test here, of the norm sample, the less likely students are to have these types of scores, these types of standard scores. Okay, so you've got your 55 and below. That's the place where your students with FMD typically range, and then you have your 70 and below, and that's where your MMD. That 70 and down for a standard score on IQ, and I'm talking about a full scale score. 70 and down to 55 is MMD range, and 55 and below is what we're talking about with FMD range. Now I'm going to throw up another one here. And this one's hot linked. It has links like, so if you go up and you click on it on that MMD, it will take you to the eligibility for MMD. And you'll know that eligibility hits right at 70. You see your FMD is 55. And then I've got the other 4 that are really prevalent. These are the ones that we over-identify, okay? These are some of the ones that we sometimes get the eligibility, maybe we're a little too creative with it. We'll just say it that way. And so your students with autism can range, and that really should be all the way across. Okay. They can go up to 145. They can go down to 55. Okay. Or they can go down to 40. That autism should be all the way across, really. I just threw it in that range right there because I wanted you to realize that students with autism, if you've met one student with autism, you've met one student with autism. And if you've seen one IEP, you should have seen one IEP. Okay. So make sure we remember that. But when you're looking at just that average range, your SLD, that's a specific learning disability. Now, you're going to have a higher standard score from the IQ, but a lower academic score. Okay. So the discrepancy between the two, what's expected and what you're actually doing with math, let's say, because Stephanie's a math person, let's say you got a 98 IQ. The range that we typically look at is if that score is 22 points below in math or reading, then we probably got a student that is qualifying for SLD. Now, it doesn't work like that, okay? We have a table, and we have graphs, and we have things that we have to look at. We do a discrepancy model, okay? But we say if there's no standard score available from the achievement test, we would use 22 points as a non-standard score method. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but really, really, really what we're talking about here is, hey, there's a higher potential for learning, and the kid's not quite achieving what's expected in range with the IQ. And that's where we see that. DD is for the little ones. That's ages 3 through 9. You have to have another disability at 9 if you're going to stay in the program. But 3 through 9, we're looking at those 5 areas of development. It's a little bit different, but you're going to have either, if you qualify, you're either going to have one area where you have 2 standard deviations below the mean. That would be a score of 70. Or you're going to have 2 areas where you're 1.5 standard deviation below the mean. And if you see right there, just above the yellow little hook, there's a 77.5. That's 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. So anything, if you're just talking to a judge in a courtroom and they're looking at a psychological report and they're not an educator, if the kid's got a score in that range right there, 77.5 or below, that's what they consider disabled in the real world. Okay. Now we have to meet criteria based on what Kentucky tells us our 14 disability categories. Like I said, this is just 6 of our 14. Okay. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Those are the high incidents. Those are the ones that we over-identify. Those are the ones that end us up in some trouble if we over-identify on those. Okay. So getting eligibility is important. I just want you to consider for a second. I know I've done a lot of talking, but I want you to consider if you had your own child and you went to an eligibility meeting and we missed it. We misappropriated it. We got it wrong. Just think about how that can just create all kinds of issues. So this is one of the most important things you do in special education as a special education teacher is you wrap your head into these pieces. I am going to talk about norms here for just a second. Norms are your child's performance when it's compared to other children at the same age. It's a norm test. All the tests that we use are norm reference tests. Okay. They're not curriculum based. They're not probes. They're not screeners. They're all norm reference. That means there's a sample of kids that have taken the test and they've created an average around those kids that took it. And then we're taking your student in that one moment in time, like Stephanie said. I love that. And we're comparing it to that group of kids. And this is how you did. Okay. The tests have been normed against thousands of children in the US. The bigger the sample, typically the more reliable and valid the test is. Okay. In general, the larger the sample size, the more accurate the results. Okay. That's what we want to say about that. Now, here's your mean and standard deviation. Okay. One standard deviation above is in the 84th percentile. That means you're scoring as well as 84 people of the 100 that took it. Out of 100, you scored as well as 84. Two standard deviations above, 98 percentile. Wow. What is two standard deviations? Two standard deviations, one standard deviation is 15 points. So if the average, it's two standard deviations above the mean. What is the mean? Let's go back to our slide. So your average score, your average standard score is 100. That's the average, okay? One standard deviation is 15 points. You add those two together, you get 130. Exactly. That is exactly how you do it. One standard deviation below the moon is the 16th percentile. We're talking 85. So anything between the 16th and the 84th essentially is in the average range. Some people would say 25th percentile. There's an argument about that. Okay. And two standard deviations below the mean is the second percentile. You're only doing as well as two students out of 100 if you're there. Okay. That's the 70 IQ. Okay. The mean is the average score on the measurement in the 50th percentile, and it's a 100 score. That's why it's sometimes confusing for parents. We got to be sure about this, right? So if we look at this, the mean, the average is 100, standard deviation of 15. In a normal distribution, about 68% of the people score one standard deviation or between 85 and 115. About 95% of the people score within two standard deviations between 70 and 130. And then about 99.7% of the people score within all those three standard deviations between 55 and 145. So you would have a very low chance of being below 55 or above 145. If a student has a score of 85, that's one standard deviation below the mean. This score is considered in the low average range. So you get that kind of verbiage in a psychoeducational report. All right. So I just want to make sure that we're in keeping with that. So we got the types of scores. Sometimes you'll see standard scores. Sometimes you'll see scaled scores. Now, these T scores, where the mean is 50 and the standard deviation is 10, sometimes we get T scores on rating scales, okay? And so the closer you get to 100 with a rating scale, we're talking Connors rating, we're talking autism rating scales, we're talking ADHD Ts and things like that. These are these qualitative things we take where we take perception of the person that's actually putting it down, and they're given a rating. And the closer that student gets to 100, it's just in reverse of what you think. I really want you to get this. So if your score is up there in the 90s, you're more likely to have significant issues with that maladaptive behavior. Or you're much more likely, the closer you get to 100, to have symptoms of ADHD. Does that make sense? So you'll see that lots of times represented in T scores. All right. Now we're going to look at the WISC for just a second. This is the verbal comprehension, the visual spatial, the fluid reasoning, the working memory, the processing score. Okay.
Paul, you had somebody ask, was this T scores?
Yes. Say that again.
They asked, was this T scores?
Okay. Katie, if you want to unmute and clarify, I'm not really sure what you're asking. Or did I
Yeah,
answer the
so
question?
so when you were saying when you're closer to 100,
Uh-huh.
you're more towards that malda can't remember the exact wording you said. That was
Okay,
a
I know,
piece
I
of
know.
it, right?
Yes, I know I'm going fast. Think in terms of if you've got a child and you're considering them OHI. I'm just going to try to put it in a practical example here. You got a kid that's OHI, all right, and they're considering other health impairment. The parent walks in and says, I've got an ADHD diagnosis. Okay. The school then is supposed to take that under consideration, but not immediately give services. We have to evaluate. And when we evaluate, we give rating scales. Okay. And these rating scales are just the opposite of standard scores. The closer you get to 100 on a standard score on an achievement test, like a reading test, then that's more the average range. But the closer you get 100 on a rating scale, an ADHD or a Connors rating scale or a BASC, the closer you get to 100, the more significant that behavior is. Okay. So it's just the opposite of what you think of. So you're thinking about, okay, does this student exhibit symptoms of ADHD? The closer that score is to 100, and they're scaled. You have to look at each test because some of them are at 70, that's the high range. Some of them are 80, that's the high range. Some of them go up to 100. But the closer, the higher the score on that scale or on that T, the more significant that behavior is, or more prevalent that behavior is what that's saying. So you just have to notice that difference. Does that help?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so here's some other common IQ tests. The WIPSI is for preschool. It's for your threes to fives. It gives you a standard score. It gives you an IQ score. Okay, that's your 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. At 6, the WISC kicks in and it goes to 16. At 17, the WAIS, the adult intelligence scale, kicks in. And then you got the KABC, that's the Kaufman, which is another cognitive measure, the Woodcock Johnson. What I would like to say here to you is if you have, and this is always a possibility, let's say you go to a meeting, you do eligibility results, you get all the way through it, you do everything, you think the kid's eligible, the kid needs specially designed instruction, they have an adverse effect. We got everything in all our ducks in a row, and the parent says, I don't agree with the results. What do? The parents have the right to get an independent evaluation at the school district's expense. Okay. So if I've given the WISC in my initial report that the school did, then when I send them to get a new report and it's within a year, if it's like in 2 months, and it will be, you have to give them a different measure because the score would be invalid if we turned around and gave the WISC. So that's why I put those up there. I want you to be aware the Stanford Binet is one, the Woodcock Johnson Cognitive is one, and the KABC is one. Verbal comprehension is the first subtest. Its tasks are to look at how a student works with language, their critical thinking skills, their oral expression. Sample question, what does captain mean? Vocabulary is something we're going to, or how are painting and statue alike? Those are typical questions on that test. Okay. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. Visual spatial. Visual spatial index tests the ability to process information, understand part to whole relationships. So there's lots of impacts. Now, what we got to do as a practitioner is we got to say, what does this score mean? What does this mean? And can we tell the parent what it means? And can we tell, and more importantly, what we're going to do about it? You see what I'm saying? So you as a teacher need to know these pieces. Okay. I can't tell you how important it is and if you have questions about them, please don't hesitate to ask us. But they're looking at visual spatial display and they're able to, can they represent it in the way they're seeing it? And do the symbols make sense? Those kinds of things, whole part relationships and show how the relationships
This
are.
is also the kid who thinks that they can fit like 900 things in their backpack because the space looks huge to them, but in reality, the space is not as big as they think.
That's exactly right. And then you got fluid logical reasoning. And again, this is all about seeing patterns, assessing comprehension of concepts that underlie mathematics. Again, this one works on mathematics. Okay. So this one, such as logic, symbolic representation, nonverbal reasoning. On the example on the right, you have to balance the scale. You would have to make the two balance. You see what I'm saying? So you're having to see, how does those symbols relate to that picture? And then which one comes next? Can you predict? Can you logically see what the sequence is going to be? And that's what so you would see how that would impact mathematics. Working memory is the ability to take information in and hold it while manipulating or simultaneously holding knowledge. Can you repeat numbers? Okay, I give you a 5, 6, 2, 4, and then a 4, 2, 6, 5, and can you say all those back to me in the correct order? Okay. I want to talk about working memory a little bit. Working memory is, you have short-term working memory and you have long-term memory. Okay. The whole point of education is to move short-term memory to long-term sustained memory. Okay. That's the point of it. That deep learning. Okay. It's harder than it sounds. I can talk about it all day, but you have to really realize that when working memory is impacted, it impacts just about everything you do. If it's basic math facts and remembering 2 times 2 is 4, or if it's remembering a concept or a word or a vocabulary piece, it's all of that, right? Being able to recall that, or being able to, let me give you another example. You got a kid that can read words like crazy, or you got a kid that can't read words like crazy. Their fluency is impacted. They take it working memory. So much brain power's been used, they can't hold what the meanings of those words are in their brain long enough to when they get to the end of the sentence, they know what they read. Does that make sense? So that's what we're talking about with working memory. And then processing speed is the last of the 5 pieces. Processing speed index consists of time task with visual input and written output, and assess how quickly information can be taken in and expressed. Okay. So you can't, that might be a bad picture, but can you make the key match? Can you make the symbols match? Right. And how quickly can you do it? How quickly can you process that you've got to put that symbol with that number? That's one part of that test that's given. And then is there a matching symbol in the second part? You would pick out the matching symbol over here. And how quickly can you process that visual information? It's a lot of visual stuff, right? And so that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about that, the scores that come out of that. The common assessments for academics is the WJ4, the KTEA, and the one that we use more prevalent is the Wyatt 4. Now, the reason we use the Wyatt 4, it's not that they're so much better a test than the others. It's just the one that the state has a discrepancy model comparison between the IQ score on the WISC, which is the one everybody likes to use, and the Wyatt scores, and there's a comparison between the two. So we can take that table and we can say that kid qualifies specific learning disability. So in academic assessments, if we're looking at reading, we could be doing things like decoding or reading fluency or phonological awareness, rapid naming of letters or words. And we're looking at reading comprehension ultimately. In writing, we're looking at fine motor skills, spelling, grammar, structure, the process, the fluency, the ability to do composition and essay. Just thinking about working memory. If you can't remember the steps of the writing process, if you can't remember to restate the question, give a few details and write a summary at the end or a closing statement. If you can't remember that process because working memory won't allow you to, we have to teach them to overcome that some way, right? We have to work on that. And the only way to get our working memory better is to work on it, to practice it, and to incorporate it into your specially designed instruction. Math. We look at reasoning, we look at calculation, we look at fluency, we look at number sense, and I'm sure that Stephanie can add a ton of stuff, but this is what the academic achievement test does, okay? These are the areas that it tests, okay? So a sample WISC profile might look something like this. You get a standard score of 85 on verbal comprehension. You get a full scale score, and that's the one we use. That full scale score is the one that qualifies us for eligibility purposes. Down at the bottom, you see it? And then you got a processing speed score of 73. And why I have another processing speed score on there, I have no idea. I need to fix this, okay? There should be just 5. Verbal comprehension, 85. fluid reasoning 92, working memory 78, processing 73, full scale 80. Okay. I've left out visual spatial. Clearly, that should be visual spatial down there with a 90. Okay. We all make mistakes. Okay. So a Wyatt standard score breakdown, again, if you are hitting around 90 to 109, you're average, at or near grade level peers. That's what it's saying in that particular area, reading, writing, math. Okay. Now it also tests oral expression and listening comprehension. Those are the other two pieces that I didn't mention, but we do those rarely. We do those only when there's a language processing deficit or there's a listening processing deficit that's been identified through the RTI process. And we're looking at LD in that area specifically, and we rarely do that. So if we had time, we could go into looking at some of these scores and determining how we would use them. We're running a little bit thin on time, but I wanted to get as much information to you as possible. Okay. When we combine the scores, when we look at the Wyatt scores, it's very important that we use total scores. Okay. We use total reading. We use a basic reading standard score based on these two subtest scores over here on the right. So you can get confused with that because when you get that printout, it's going to spit out a bunch of subtest scores and they'll have standard scores to them. But you need to think about the total scores, the basic, the reading comprehension. That's what we use for eligibility. Okay. Now, if we break it down and we say we pinpoint that pseudo word decoding is a weakness or a need, then we can look at that score and we can turn that into instruction. We can turn that into goals and objectives. Okay. But for eligibility purposes, we're looking at those total scores. Here's another real world example on your Wyatt. These scores indicate consistent academic underperformance across multiple domains. You can see those scores are in the 80s and the 70s. Now, when you're doing an MMD kid for eligibility, if those scores are represented like that, they don't all have to be 70 or below, okay? There just has to be an overall acquisition and performance issue with these students. So if they're down like that, one score of 81 in word reading is not going to keep you from being identified as MMD. We look at holistically the kid. We look at the adaptive behavior. We look at the behavioral observations. We look at all the scores and make a call. We triangulate that data. Okay. So don't get hung up on one score and teach your parents not to get hung up on one score. I want to say that again. Okay. When a student is considered significantly and consistently behind, multiple Wyatt standard scores below 80, subtest scores across content areas falling into borderline or extremely low ranges, and consistent with classroom data. You should have all kinds of classroom data. Okay. And if you don't, you're probably skating on thin ice because you're supposed to verify whether they've had the proper experiences in reading and mathematics. You got your Vineland adaptive behavior. This is the third piece that's super important. Now, the adaptive behavior, it tests how well a person copes with everyday life demands in real-world settings. It's used for diagnosing intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism, and evaluating support needs in IEPs for functional behavior. Now, the law says that the IEP is not just for academics. It's not just for working memory. It's not just for goals in those academic areas. It's for function too. And what functions are we talking about? We're talking about communication. We're talking about functional communication, understanding, expressing, and using language, receiving information, being able to understand it, expressing information, and writing it. Okay. Daily living skills, personal care, household, socialization. Now, here's the thing to remember. If you've got kids scoring in the 70s on these particular, once you hit that 77 and a half, you're looking at a deficit. Okay. That's what you're looking at. And so you should be addressing some of these things. Now you're thinking, okay, you got an MMD kid. He's got reading difficulties. He's got math difficulties. He's got functional behavior difficulties. He's got behavior issues. We got all kinds of things there. That's why we use the word priority. Okay. We prioritize sometimes what we can get done in a year. Okay. But the Vineland works on an interview. You get a parent form, you get a teacher form, and you kind of compare both. And it's for anywhere from birth to 90 it works on. Okay. Why it matters in special ed, it helps identify functional impairments. And it required for eligibility determination, and it helps determine transition planning, independent living skills, and it's useful in autism evaluations and for measuring progress on life goals that are included. But that's part of the IEP. That's part of it. So, and it's required for intellectual disabilities. It's required for every evaluation that you do. You have to get an adaptive evaluation, and the Vineland is the one that it's most prevalent.
Denny Paul, I am
Yes.
going to say that most of our kids that we have who have autism will score very low on communication just because they don't always take our sarcasm and other things into effect, nor do they understand when other things are affecting someone else, like why you're upset or that, something happened and you're upset. They don't even realize sometimes that we are upset. And so those scores will be very low most of the time for most of our autistic kids, where other things may be very high.
Yes. And those, again, score is just a moment in time, like Stephanie said earlier. I love that. And I forget that sometimes myself. Okay. I get hung up on a score and I'll say, oh, got to make this kid eligible. No, you don't have to make the kid eligible. You have to look at the whole picture of the kid and then determine it with the group. And you don't ever determine eligibility outside the ARC. Okay. Super important to remember. So if we were going to make this happen in practical terms, just a think aloud activity. We're going to walk through an eligibility form. Let's say we pop open an eligibility form off the eligibility, and it's we're going to look at mild mental disability. Okay. Now look what it says. This language that we've been talking about, now this thing makes sense, right? I'm just going to show you this really quickly. Cognitive function is at least 2 standard deviations below the mean. What's 2 standard deviations below the mean? 70. Right? We just talked about it, right? Adaptive behavior is at least 2 standard deviations below the mean. And it says, but not more than 3 standard deviations below the mean, because when you hit 3, you hit the FMD range, right? Severe deficits exist in overall academic performance. Remember I said, you don't get hung up on one score that's 81 and you got a bunch of 70s and 60s. That overall acquisition is what we're talking about in performance. Okay. Retention, acquisition, retention, and application of knowledge. If we're having struggles with all those, then we can find that student eligible with those scores that support it. Okay. And when you look right back
some
here,
classroom data down here in that supporting documents, I think that's important on how that affects them.
no question. And we triangulate the data here. So this supporting documentation, in my mind, is much more important than the check boxes. Yes, we got to have the check boxes. And when you do a check box, you have to do all yeses down through here. Okay. And you can see there's an adverse effect on educational performance. They need specially designed instruction. And, they've had reading and math proper experiences, and English proficiency is not a determining factor. So you got some things to do, but it says used multiple sources to triangulate the data and substantiate the existence of a disability. Now, really quickly, I'm going to try to get back where I was, and I'm going to show you really quickly just what, when we're talking about general intelligence, I just did a quick one here. And as you can see on the screen, we're talking some standard scores here, but we're also talking about how we don't write goals from general intelligence section on present level, but we talk about how it's impacting other areas. Okay. That's what we do. And then we write into our specially designed instruction how we're going to attack working memory, or how we're going to attack verbal comprehension deficits, or how we're going to look at visual spatial display issues or fluid reasoning or processing speed, and how we're going to address those through strategies. So we've come to the end of our time. I really appreciate your attentiveness. I really appreciate each and every one of you.